All right, Thomas, we're live. Welcome to the Jay Burden Show.
Yeah, thank you, man. It's a pleasure, and I appreciate you reaching out.
Yeah, definitely, man. I've been a big fan of your work. I found you, like most people, at least I think, through AA, and then later on Piquinona's revisionism series, which has been just great. But I really wanted to ask you about something that I haven't heard you talk about before. I've heard a lot of people talk to you about revisionism, and that's great. That's important. But I'll be perfectly honest. I'm not knowledgeable to add any more to that discussion, right? At least from my perspective, right? Like there are more qualified people than I. But I do want to talk with you about something that you've mentioned, but at least never discussed deliberately, which is kind of your own faith and your own Protestant faith. So, if you could just very briefly, and I'm not looking for a full biography, but if you could just kind of explain, your relationship to faith and how you would, I guess, currently describe yourself.
I mean, I'm a Calvinist Presbyterian. That's how I was raised. I both sides of my family. I've got rather deep Protestant roots, and tracing my genealogy, which I did some years back. I only found one Catholic ancestor in the last century and a half. In most jurisdictions in the past, one's confessional heritage, as well as their race, was listed and for purposes of census data, which is interesting. In fact, I don't have an absolute. I don't have a complete data set, of the last 200 years or something for the United States of America, and it varied a lot by jurisdiction in terms of how these procedures were managed and under what authority. But from what in my own research, it was slightly more common for confessional orientation to be listed than race, which is interesting. But that makes sense because old America, that was very, very significant to people, not just in their own lives, but in political terms. And I've always, I remain, a Presbyterian today. I made the point before, and it's not like this is some idea original to me or something, or not idea. It's not like this is some observation or like take that unique to me, but people really can't escape their confessional heritage anyway. I like Paul Schrader, the filmmaker, a lot. Like he wrote Taxi Driver, even though Scorsese directed it. Schrader also made the film Hardcore, which with George C. Scott, which I think is kind of underrated. It's a disturbing film, and it's something of a period piece, but it's got a very strong theological motif. Schrader did the biopic of Yukio Mishima, A Life in Four Chapters. He did a great film called The Yakuza, of which Ridley Scott's Black Rain is kind of a spiritual sequel or companion piece. In any event, Schrader was from Michigan, and he was raised in a staunchly Calvinist household, rigidly so. Calvinism is a very severe faith in some among some people. Okay, it kind of categorically is severe. All right, at least by kind of modern metrics, but some communities and some families are more rigid in kind of its the observance of its strictures in day-to-day affairs, and particularly family and social life. But Schrader was always making the point that he made 2 points that when he went to Los Angeles to make films, this was a profound culture shock. More so than it would have been, obviously for a Catholic or a Jew. Secondly, he made the point that even people who declare themselves to be atheists or declare themselves to have, left the faith of their family and parentage, you never really escape your confessional heritage. Okay, even these guys, even these guys and some ladies who, who claim that, they're quote unquote lapsed Catholics or former Catholics, when they talk about their ethics, like warped as their ethics may be, their conceptual horizon remains Catholic. When you find these like Rockefeller Republican types, or when you did, I mean, they don't really exist anymore, but these kinds of Rockefeller Republicans who oppose Nixon and were very much conservative in name only, in the 70s. They were very much, they were self-declared secular humanists, a lot of them, but they were very Protestant in their orientation. Okay, similarly on the right, you'll find thinkers like Anthony Ludovici, who was I mean, he wasn't an atheist in the way that new atheists are, or like and he certainly wasn't a dialectical materialist, but he was kind of a proto-fascist Nietzschean. But he had this very, very kind of Catholic Romanist like view of ethics, of aesthetics, of all these things. Okay, I made the point before, the Soviet Union, as well as the countries under occupation, that shared some cultural traits in common. The Soviet Union came to be more and more Byzantine and superficially kind of orthodox in its practices. From the kind of preservation of Lenin's body as a relic, to the kind of pageantry of the Kremlin mausoleum, to these elaborate funerals of state apparatchiks. Like, don't get me wrong, like I'm not saying something bad about the Orthodox faith, and obviously what the communists were doing was a completely warped counterfeit version of sacral practices, but it owed very much to kind of Byzantine Orthodox heritage. Okay, it was a return to these familiar forms, and however like warped a capacity. So that's important to keep in mind. Okay, so to bring it back, kind of down to earth, and more like directly respond to your query. I never really questioned my own faith. I mean, I've asked a lot of questions on my faith from the time I went to confirmation to, now at, just about 46 years old. But I never went through a phase or something where like I didn't believe in God, or where like I rejected, Calvinism, or I rejected the Bible or anything like that. So I've always, throughout my life, I've never had a true crisis of faith, and I've never been inclined to abandon the faith of my fathers, as it were. But also, even if I want to I think like a Calvinist, and people have pointed it out to me, but I knew it anyway, So, and then that's just, I agree with you, Michael Jones, okay, with some qualifications. I mean, obviously he's a big Catholic, but and I agree with him in some senses when he talks about the kind of intellectual poverty and historically erroneous features of white nationalism, but I think he takes it too far in kind of viewing race as not particularly significant, because politically it's got tremendous significance. Okay, but at the same time, he is right when he talks about how your culture really is your confessional heritage. And especially in America, the way to understand America is at elite levels. I mean, I'm not talking about like on the street and people's kind of sociological experience, with different races and things, and their personal associations. I'm talking about, if you want to understand kind of at the elite level, like what the kind of political intrigues involve, and what the parties are. America is more like Bosnia than it was South Africa or something. It's basically a fight between Catholics, Protestants, and Jews, and there's kinds of shifting alliances they're in, and sometimes two gang up against the other, sometimes they're all at loggerheads, but that's the way to understand it. And that's why it's peculiar when I run into guys who claim that they're like atheists, but they have some kind of like a hard view on race, or they claim that they're these big political partisans. It's like, if you don't have a confessional heritage, or if you don't take it seriously, or if it's not like part of your identity, that's really kind of artificial and rootless. it's not just and I mean historical experience bears that out. That's not just some that's not just some that's not just some conceit of mine. And maybe it's because I'm an extreme minority where I live, and I always have been 'cause I'm in Chicago. Um, what used to be called like white ethnics, like Catholic people and like old Stockton Center prods, like I am, we're very different people. I mean, we're not different in the way like white folks and black folks are. We're not different in the way like a Christian and a Muslim is. But this idea that this is some superficial distinction is not true at all, man. There's very profound cultural differences, and thankfully, in a lot of ways, those have been kind of bridged. And I think Catholic people are great. I it's not an issue with that at all. But this idea that this is some sort of insignificant thing, the kind of people who say that they're either intellectually very immature or or they just don't really get not just kind of the nature of deep politics and historical terms, and specifically they don't really get America and what it's kind of a ethno-political like constellation involves, and like who the players are, so to speak, and like what their values are and what they're trying to do. I realized I went like far and beyond, the question, which was just like, what's my faith? How do I relate to it? If that's the proper way to characterize it. But I've kind of dedicated my life to writing about political matters and like involving myself in these things as much as I can. So I can't really extricate a kind of historical and political orientation from my own confessional heritage, because that's the way I understand it.
No, that's insightful.
Yeah.
I'm glad to listen. If
Okay.
you can,
Yeah. I mean,
if you can,
that's yeah. That's. I mean, I don't have any more to add on that count unless you've got something you want me to clarify in that
no,
regard.
not at all. If you can forgive me a digression, what you said about never being able to escape your confessional history, it reminds me of a story my grandfather told me. So my grandfather was an aircraft mechanic in Laos during the
Oh
Vietnam
wow,
War,
wow,
and
that's very cool.
as you can imagine, right, there were a lot of Koreans there, and they had horrible problems with the Korean airplanes. They would always go down, and one of the things that they found out was essentially that the Korean language made it incredibly difficult to bring an issue up the chain of command. Right.
Wow.
So like, look, Orwell is kind of a goofy guy, but I think that the way he describes language and language control in his work is essential. Right. And the point was, and what my grandfather always said was, until they taught the pilots English, they couldn't bring up issues. It was just difficult in the structure of the language itself to bring up to someone over top of you, hey, this is a problem. We need to fix this. Or to say, no, we're not going to do that. We need to fix the plane first. And so I kind of view religion in a similar way, where it's the framework through which you view authority, right? God being the ultimate authority. And so the way that you relate to God, that you relate to your priest class, is shaped by your confessional history. And that's an essential part of, I guess, how you view politics and kind of, I guess, like the ruling of men, right?
No, hugely. And it's also too, I'll add, I wanted to continue, and that's a great analogy, by the way. And I had no idea about that aspect of the Korean language. But I spent a lot of time around Koreans owing to where I live. That there's a lot of Koreans on the North Shore of Chicago, which people might not know. But that's fascinating, and that's also a very apropos analogy. But I'll get back to you in a second. But to your point, yeah, you're absolutely right that theology is basically the conceptual vocabulary of one's perception and their conceptual horizon. And I'll also add one of Carl Schmitt's great insights, of which there were many, was in political existential terms, is that all political paradigms are conceptually theological. Even if they claim, like to again invoke the example, the 20th century, Stalinist Garrison states, you have the system in question purports to be quote atheist, or even if it purports to be, irreligious or even like anti-religious. Politics, it's exactly what you said. Vis-a-vis, man's conceptual horizon as relates Confessional Heritage. Identically, politics is the lens through which man perceives authority, and it is always nakedly theological, even if it's dressed up in secularist or modernist trappings, or even if it's purported to be a science or something. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and that's the thing that, because I kind of came into my own kind of at the tail end of the new atheist movement. It never grabbed me, but it was something that was kind of in the water. And what was always so frustrating to me is that there was this kind of attack on religion as, oh, you can't justify it outside of its own system, right? Like, justify it in my system. But that Carl Schmitt idea is essential, right? Because any system of belief has kind of a core, like, just assertion about the world that it's kind of all built on. That kind of political theology, no matter what it is. If it's kind of Dawkins atheism, if it's communism or anything. And you kind of just have to make peace with the fact that not everything is a syllogism. There is some kind of initial premise on which everything is based, Well,
also, yeah, I mean, in symbolic psychological terms, I mean, even if the problem with the new atheism specifically, and one of the reasons why it just kind of unceremoniously died and now people are embarrassed about it, is because there's some, I mean, first of all, there's something nasty about it. It was just kind of bigoted, towards religion qua religion. But it's also, I mean, it was specious on its own terms. I mean, like, take the example of Dawkins or another lightweight kind of odiferous figuratively and literally character, Chris Hitchens. These guys were making they were presenting absolute moral postulates, but they weren't providing the intellectual legs for these things to stand on, for really speaking. Like, you read Chris Hitchens, you talk about how racism is this grave evil, whatever racism means. Homophobia, which is an absurd term, but taking it to mean opposition to sodomy and things. This is a grave evil, but you can't. It's like, why? It's like, okay, if you really are an atheist, you can't fall back on natural law arguments to prop up your atheism. Like, maybe, quote, homophobia is bad. I don't really see how you could argue that that's bad, but, like, let's say if you truly are an atheist, there'd be no moral content to that judgment. It's like, maybe it'd be, like, bad for business to discriminate against people based on these weird habits of theirs, or maybe it's something that shouldn't be within the contemplation of people as regards public morals just generally. But how can it be some grave? How can it be a moral evil to oppose something like that? So there's that, and it's also there was a basic misunderstanding. Like, if you read last summer, I powered my way through a lot of Marxist Leninist theory. I mean, not just because I'm a masochist or because I wanted to be mean to myself, as Calvinists often are, including myself. But it owed to a lot of what I was writing. I was kind of deep diving, into the Cold War. I mean, I always kind of am, but it was I was specifically addressing kind of the proverbial loss of faith in Marxist Leninism that came to characterize the last phase of Soviet power. And I was kind of deep diving into what replaced it, and to understand, one's got to understand that to understand the Russian Federation of 2022. But in any event, Marx was an incredibly destructive person. I'd go as far as and I'm reluctant to assign these kinds of moral judgments to historical personages because it sounds like moral cant. But I think I even go as far as to say that Marx was an evil person who was in revolt against God, okay, in a naked and total capacity. But Marxist Leninist atheism, it was fairly well thought out. It wasn't this kind of dumb histrionic, bigoted moral cant of Dawkins and Hitchens. Kind of like the within Marxist, there is a Marxian metaphysics, okay, and within that paradigm, the idea is that religion as it existed within cycles of historical development, like everything else within man's conceptual horizon, reflected the paradigm of productive means, labor, and authority therein. Because no matter what man does within the Marxist paradigm, he can't escape that. But if you were to like ask a Marxist, okay, like like how can we how can we resolve the kind of mystery of the origin of life? They'd probably say like, no, some things are just beyond man's understanding, but that doesn't matter because the challenge to us is man's existence here on earth, and how to overcome these oppressive modalities, and and advance the end of history so that like true justice can be realized on earth. Like they wouldn't like no Marxist in either in 1885 or in 1985 would have sat there and regaled you with some with some shrieking moral cant, like Dawkins style, about how evil it is that you believe in God. Like that's just not the way they approached it. There's something that's there's something uniquely infantile and kind of and characteristic of the kind of post 1945 secular humanist regime that's profoundly it's as anti-intellectual as it is sort of smugly self-assured of its own righteousness. If that makes any sense. I
No,
realize I figured the long-winded tangent.
Well, it's odd that you bring up Marx and Satan, because one of my favorite works by interestingly enough a hardcore Calvinist, but is Milton's Paradise Lost. And it's no secret, right, that Satan is essentially the main character, and kind of that Promethean aspect of like, I would rather rule in hell than serve in heaven, is actually something Marx was kind of obsessed with, right?
Oh yeah.
He famously called Satan the first free thinker. And if you read a lot of his poetry too, you get these very odd, dark descriptions of Satan, and like just essentially murdering truth and kind of like casting down kind of like the hierarchy of heaven. And again, like, look, I'm not the greatest Marxist scholar. I've read the Communist Manifesto and a little bit of Lenin. I'm not going to pretend to be some academic on the subject, but in my exposure, right, it does seem like he was very conscious of that motif.
Oh yeah, definitely. Well, it's also too and I mean, we can move on in a minute. I just wanted to kind of, for context, it was on my mind the other day. One of the ways to understand the new atheism, and I make this point a lot in something I'm writing currently. I don't want to be a shill, but my next science fiction book is dropping imminently, but I'm working on an academic text that's about 200 pages. It's kind of an introductory. Text, just kind of dealing with the post 1945 world order. But so that's key to understanding the 20th century. What Hobsbawm, I mean, while we're on the subject of Marx, like I cite Hobsbawm and some of his heterodox takes on historical epochs. Like he very much rejected kind of like the linear view of history, so he was not a traditional Marxist in that regard. But Hobsbawm was always talking about the quote short century, of the 20th century, with entailing 1914 to 1989, and that entire conflict cycle. Be as it may, the thing that's about the 20th century is that religion had taken this tremendous hit. Okay, and people just viewed from the common man to people in authority, to the intelligentsia, such that it still could have been said to exist. Like people just there just was a basic absence of faith, and there's this idea that the world was explicable through analysis of material quantities. That's one of the reasons why Marxism developed the kind of momentum it did, and it became so insinuated into political life, and this it became, there was like this penumbric shadow over all discourse and political activity in the 20th century, even when people on the right, I made the point before, people they talk about the German Reich, and its biological racialism, as if this was not, as this was both, this horrible evil, but also this kind of strange, kind of like outlier phenomenon. Like it wasn't at all. I made the point before that every advanced country, whether it was the German Reich or the British Empire or the Japanese Empire, or France, like everybody viewed, man as basically a biological machine, and culture is derived from these biological principles, and your race or your blood, because in those days, obviously, there wasn't an understanding of the human genome and things. The idea that blood, kind of not just determined, people's behavioral proclivities, but that somehow the capacity for culture and everything else was coded into your physical makeup. This touching at this conceptual prejudice, like touching and concerned everything. And one of the things that brought down communism, I mean, it was an epochal phenomenon that brought down communism. Okay, it was a whole constellation of factors and processes of history. But the kind of paradigm shift, a major component of the paradigm shift that brought it down was the fact that people rejected not just dialectical materialism, but that entire materialist worldview that came to view everything as grounded in physical phenomenon. And there really was a return to faith. There really was an Islamic awakening, and that directly collided with the Soviet Union. Not just in the battle space of Afghanistan, but across its entire frontier, and within the Oblast, where what the Kremlin called the nationalities who were majority Islamic resided, but also I mean, the Pope John Paul was the momentum that was developed by Solidarity and Lech Walesa, like the fact that was a Catholic social movement was instrumental in in the momentum it developed. Like Orban Orban's roots are in the communist, the anti-communist resistance movement. And he makes the point that the reemergence of faith was instrumental in Hungary in undermining the credibility of the regime in absolute terms. So these new atheist types, I mean, not only were they really weak in terms of their intellectual foundations, but they were really kind of, this was kind of them trying to like return the serve when after their legs had been cut off from underneath them, and they were thinking that somehow they could mount they could mount some sort of comeback in intellectual circles in the 2000s, and that's one reason why Dawkins was fixated on trying to piggyback his bigoted worldview on science, and Hitchens was had less finesse and was a lot more crass about it. Hitchens' whole thing, like a typical Trotskyist, and like a typical like a lot of Zionists do too. He was suggesting that this kind of laundry list of boogeymen of the post-Marxist left is the progeny of just religion. Whether it's whether he was calling for genocidal assaults on Muslim peoples without provocation, or whether he was slandering Christians, white Christians, or whether he was saying horrible things about the Catholic Church. He was very, in a very cheap and crass way, trying to direct that kind of bigoted hostility towards religion qua religion, and it's very, I mean, it's very, very grotesque, but also thankfully kind of doomed to failure. And again, I didn't mean to ramble on that, but it's an important point.
No, not at all. It's odd to me too, because not to just endlessly talk about myself, but I'm in kind of the Central Virginia area, in one of the capitals of the Bible Belt, right? And so it's odd to me because thank you. Yeah, it's odd to me because there's this kind of boogeyman in the atheist liberal psychology, right? And it's that the like classic old stock American Peckerwood is simultaneously this, like 75 IQ inbred moron, and then also this like backwoods Ubermensch who's secretly pulling all of the strings in power, and is just one step away from, plunging us into some type of like, absurd, 17th century Puritan theocracy.
No, it's wild.
It's one of those just inherent contradictions. And my point is not, oh, look, the left is a hypocrite, because that's not a particularly useful game, right? But it is one of those things that it does kind of just bother you after a while. It's like, well, just make up your mind. Am I dangerous or am I pathetic?
Well, it's just bad propaganda. Like there's two things I wanted to note. People on the left, I've heard not just like online herbs, but like in the real world. I've heard these crazy woke types talk about, quote, the church, and I'll ask them, like, what is the church? I go to a church. It's like, what is this? Do we live in 16th century Spain? Like, what is the church? I mean, it's. I think there's like I think among the rank and file are just kind of like slob, like kind of trashy goy types. They really don't. They're so impoverished of culture, and they were raised with kind of nothing but television and like convenience store snacks. They really don't understand that there's this whole kind of denominational aspect to Christianity, and that fact kind of created the modern world. But also, I remember in the entire Anglosphere, it's there's that boogeyman, to your point, and it's so at odds with reality. It's like the most remote possible outcome. Like there's this really, in the early 2000s. I don't know if you remember this or not, because I don't know how old you are, and I don't know. But there's this really moronic, Alan Moore comic in a movie called V for Vendetta, and like all kinds of people like misconstrued that movie. Like it's like this huge like commie woke movie, but then like these anarchists and like types and these guys who think they're right wing were running around in Guy Fawkes masks, the imitation of the main character. Like apparently didn't understand that the whole movie is basically like a commie like woke movie. But in the movie, its dystopia is that there's this kind of radical Anglican political party that imposes this kind of like Handmaid's Tale Taliban type regime on England, like based on Anglicanism. Like that's like the odds of that happening are the odds of like sentient dinosaurs reemerging, or like dinosaurs reemerging, becoming sentient and taking over the planet tomorrow. Like there's literally, of all possible occurrences, that is the least probable occurrence, that Anglicans are going to like suddenly become right wing, suddenly become like this kind of like fundamentalist Taliban type, like theological tendency, that they're going to like conquer England, and that like their first order of the day is like be mean to like middle class bougie ladies and like not let them get abortions. Like,
well, right, and it's to me it's the difference between, I guess we can say, the last like true Protestant theocracy in the Anglosphere, right, which is Cromwell and then maybe the tradition in New England. But if you look at those people and read about those people and what they were like, say what you will about them, they were misguided, they may have been wrong, it's a separate discussion, but these were fundamentally serious people, right? Jonathan Bowden has a collection of essays. He didn't write it, obviously. It was posthumously published, but it's called Pulp Fascism, and it's kind of a series of essays and interviews off of different pulp characters.
Okay.
But he has one on, is it Solomon Kane, the Robert E. Howard Puritan witch hunter?
Yeah, Solomon Kane.
Yeah, but he has a great essay on that. It's fascinating, right? Essentially talking about the American Protestant tradition, and talking about, in one large like extended part, what it was like in Cromwell's armies, and there was no whoring, there was no gambling, there was no drinking. Like these were serious hardcore people. And you look like, I love these people, like red state Christian Americans are my people, but they're not like that. They can barely control themselves at a buffet, let alone, this like hardcore charging into cannon fire. It's a different class of people.
Oh yeah, and it's also the that's what's really when America really started losing its way too. That's one of the things that's weird about. That's one of the reasons why there've been a handful of times I've ended up at these like quote non-denominational churches. Like quasi. We don't really have mega churches in Chicagoland, but that it's
In
that
that
same
mold.
sort of thing. There's been a handful of times when like somebody invited me to church with them and I didn't want to be rude, so like I went. And one of the reasons why I can't cotton that kind of stuff is because it's. I mean, aside from the fact that I think a lot of it's bad theology and it's not truly, it's not truly Bible Protestantism, but they're fixated on like mirroring popular culture, and I mean that's really really weird. I guess their notion is that the way to stay quote relevant is to mirror pop culture, but that's really that. I mean, that's not just unsound in terms of in terms of what God would have of the elect in terms of their behavior and conduct and manner in which they worship, but that's also not why people gravitate to a church community. The whole you gravitate towards a congregational community because we're mired in we're surrounded by our enemies and we're mired in Gomorrah. Like I like going to church because it's not basically like the kind of clean version of of woke America like outside the doors, or it's not like they even to this day like there's like a whole genre, there's like a whole subgenre like really really corny crappy kind of like faggy like pop country music but with quote unquote Christian themes. There's like these like hokey TV shows aimed at kids which are just kind of it's like these disengaged like mega churchers like saying to Hollywood like, oh, we got that too. Like it's really really misguided and really really undignified, and also just even in practical terms that's not why people become involved in or become more involved in their faith.
Right.
um
It's just becomes it's and there's a line from King of the Hill that I love about Christian rock music. And he says, "You didn't make Christianity cooler, you just made rock music worse."
that's awesome.
Which is very true, right? So my fiance's family is from the Chicagoland area.
Oh
They're
nice.
descended from, Swedish immigrants. And
Yeah,
it's interesting,
Anderson
they
book
went to
types.
right, they went to a small Swedish Covenant college.
Yep.
Everyone was ethnically Swedish. Everyone went to church at a Swedish Covenant church. But what's interesting is kind of post civil rights law, right? Those communities got busted up. I'm sure you know. But what's
Oh yeah.
happened to the churches is as the churches kind of followed like NPR culture, right? And as they've kind of, I guess, just deracinated the kind of, tradition, which was it was a hardcore tradition, right? Like it was a pietist tradition. There were standards. It was very much like, well, the community watches what you do. When that was gone, it's now that like my fiance's 90 something year old grandparents are, telling us that we need to get our government medication and how important it is that we take in Somali refugees like they have, right? And telling us about the
Well,
true
it's also, yeah, I made that point. It's like when people, I made the point to a friend of mine the other day, and he thought I was being flippant, but he was talking about the church in England and how disgusting it is that it's basically communist. And I'm like, okay, but that problem's going to resolve itself because I'm like, and any church that goes woke, it to your point, it ends up with a congregation of two, and both of those and those two people are 98-year-old women. I mean, like it's if you're kind of laying the foundation of your own extinction. If you're a quote unquote church who decides it's going to be it's going to be an instrument of the regime. It's like the Chi-Coms maintain what they call the quote Catholic Church, but you basically go in there and you read like Mao's Little Red Book and you learn about how like Mao like made a bunch of swans appear on a mountain and how like you know Jesus was actually Chinese, and we don't really believe in miracles because we know that the center of the world is China, and it's like, but you want to know something? Like, nobody goes to that church. I mean, it's like,
well, right, and like and this is one of the I kind of enjoy making fun of, because it's my area, it's the predominant denominations. I think Baptists are kind of funny, and they're good people, but
Yeah.
they're amusing to a certain perspective, right? Like, look, I I grew up in the kind of the stomping grounds of Jerry Falwell, so he's a funny person, right? I can't deny that. But one of the things that I always give those type of people credit for is that the amount of, I guess, the amount of support those people send to, just really embattered Chinese house churches is insane, because there is a massive underground Christian community there, but it's much more similar to what was going on in, Eastern Europe in the 70s and the 60s,
Yeah.
And look, I think that Rod Dreher is a goofy guy. He's a nice guy. I've met him in person, but he is kind of a goofy person. But his book, Live Not by Lies, which is in Rod Dreher, form, a lot of it's kind of a waste of time. But he goes through and talks to kind of the families of, Iron Curtain Christian dissidents. And it's interesting what you said about, the kind of the state churches dying, because all of these areas had state churches.
Oh, yeah.
They were party informants, right? What you said in Confession meant that the Cheka showed up and you got shot in the back of the head. And so those churches died quickly.
Well, yeah, and that's why. Well, it's the same thing too. And I'm not making light of profoundly evil stuff, but like when all these freaks the last several months have been turning out, to protest in favor of their quote unquote right to abortion. Like, have you taken a look at these freaks lately? Like, they're disgusting, obese, like pathetic, sad, like figuratively and literally just like sad people with miserable little lives, who are basically demanding that the government the government is their god, is their kind of like rabbinic council of elders or whatever. And they're only moral authority in their impoverished lives. I use the term moral in loosely, in the loosest possible terms, but just conceptually in their mind, that's what it represents. But these, if evil people are going to demand a quote right to kill their own children, like, what do I care? Like, yeah, that's horrible, and that's depraved, and that's sick that people think that way. But if these people want to exterminate themselves, like, why do I care? Like, they're going to hell, and they're evil people, and I mean, they're not going to be missed on earth. I mean, I don't wish for anyone to die or want or anything like that. But this world is certainly a better place without them. I mean,
I agree.
Yeah, I'm not going to sit here and cry about these people being like degenerate freaks who want to exterminate themselves. Like, why do I care? These aren't my people, and you shouldn't care about them. Like, you shouldn't celebrate the fact that that they're mired in this kind of depravity, and that they're miserable, and that they're doing evil to themselves and others. But I've tried to make that point to people before, again and again. Like, people got to stop thinking this. You live in this. You literally live in the empire of Gomorrah, and you're surrounded by millions of people who are just sick and are like literally like in hell. Such that such that hell can exist in this plane of existence. You got to stop thinking that I mean, in general colloquial terms. It's how people, like, you got to stop thinking about these people as like part of some community that you both partake of. Like, these aren't your people. They're an unfortunate kind of obstacle to the resolution of the struggle of reason against unreason and evil and anarchy. And in a couple of generations they'll no longer exist. That's the way you got to look at it. Like, why are people emotionally invested if there's some like literally demented lady running around saying that she wants children to have sex changes, if there's some like pathetic fat guy with Kool-Aid hair screaming that he and some guy he masturbates with are quote unquote married. Like, these people are. You should look at these people the way you do like some homeless crackhead on the subway who's like screaming at people. Like, are you really upset that because you look at that guy as like your brother or something, and you've got to bring him to reason? No, you're like, that poor man's afflicted. I find it offensive that he's screaming obscenities at me, but the sooner he's kind of put out of his own misery, by or the sooner he comes to reason and comes to Christ, the better. Which either way, but the last thing I'm going to do is sit around and expend emotional energy on him or think about him or like lament the fact that he's all fucked up, because he has nothing to do with me.
Right. It's interesting you mentioned that, I guess, the low caliber of the opposition, because this is something our mutual friend Ace and I were discussing, right? Which is that, look, say what you will about the Red Army and Lenin. They were not good people, but they weren't embarrassing. They weren't these kind of profoundly dysfunctional, just like refuse. They were dangerous people. They were serious people.
Well, yeah.
And on one hand, it's comforting, right? Because look, the opposition's, they're all morons. But on the other hand, you're like, well, wait a minute. Everyone in power is, a moron with, a laundry list of sexual hangups, right? And you're like, well, that's not a great place to be.
Before, and it's like, yeah, there's two different things. They're two different phenomena. I mean, related, because they're both aspects of a historical process, and they, one is the progeny of the other in some basic sense, because the kind of constellation of historical causes of the one, resulted in the other being what we're dealing with today. But to your point, the threat of the Warsaw Pact, if you want to look at it, if you want to look at the Warsaw Pact as the greater of two evils after the war, okay, I don't want to get into, that's a whole other issue I don't want to get into right now. But that threat was, had Moscow and Peking found some way to sustain their strategic military concord, at least that kind of limited interdependence and that kind of absolute cooperation on military strategic issues, the threat posed by a state like East Germany and the Soviet Union and, the People's Republic of China, when it was aligned within that bloc, was like quite literally this kind of Oriental tyranny of Stalinism will conquer the planet. And America will basically become this kind of garrison state that, is essentially this kind of like an island, like in a planet that has been essentially Bolshevized, as to use the kind of antiquated term that was favored in describing this potential future, by people like Hitler and Mussolini. That was the threat. Okay, the post 1989, these people we're talking about, the people who post like BLM signs, like the people who march in favor of their infanticide rights, like the kind of creepy sad guy who's like screaming that you accept the fact that he and his like male friend masturbate together. Like, these people are not remotely related to the phenomenon I just described. What they are is they're this kind of natural slave caste that is the favored constituency of the victors of the Cold War. Okay, I mean, that's what they are. They're not some physical threat to us. They're not going to be mobilized. I mean, I'm obviously being silly, but they're not going to be mobilized and outfitted with Kalashnikovs to conquer our cities. They're the kind of they're the natural slave caste that is kind of the, if the regime had its way, that would basically be what the majority consisted of. This kind of really like pathetic human material that's totally malleable, that's functioning on kind of an animal level. I mean, that's not just deracinated and consists of people that have no relationship to history and have no existence outside of their discrete, isolated individual lives. But that are also incapable of living historically. Like, that's what they would ideally want to breed. As kind of the gray majority. Okay, I mean, so yeah, those people. I don't think it's a waste of time to sit around cultivating bad feelings about people, even if they're disgusting and even if they're entirely deserving of contempt. But that's this idea that, you know, like those are the people we have to fight, or alternatively, like those are the people we've got to, like, you know, bring to Christ, figuratively or literally, or those kinds of people we need to, you know, like save from themselves. Like that's nonsense. They're a speed bump, or they're like a pile of dog crap that you've got to step around or dispose of, you know, as you walk to catch, or as you run, you know, to catch your train in the city or something. Like I'm sure people are gonna say mean things about me and say like, "Oh, you're gonna lead a snub. Why are you so great? Like, fuck you." I'm not so great. That's not the point. Um, you know, the point is that by any metric, these people we're talking about are natural slaves. Like, natural slaves do exist. This isn't something Aristotle just made up. This isn't something that, you know, self-styled, you know, like Herbs who watch too many movies, you know, to declare people to be. Like, they really do exist. And if you don't believe me, I refer you to Exhibit A, and that is this population I just described and you just described. Okay. So
Well, to
yeah,
me,
these people feature way too much in kind of the contemplation of people on our side. I'm not trying to be some finger wagging jagoff or suggest I'm kind of the conceptual gatekeeper of what people should focus on. But I think this isn't just my you know, kind of eccentric take on something. It's actually important. Like, funny and silly as we may be, you know, cracking wise about it.
so I'm curious, right? One of the common themes you hear on our side of things, right, is that whatever you want to call the thing we're up against, not what you describe, which is like the kind of the lumpen proletariat, but like the actual force. You know, if you want to call it, you know, progressive universalism, whatever that is, the pause. But some people say like, oh, well, that's kind of a Protestant Christian heresy, right? That kind of took some of the premises of Protestantism and kind of corrupted it. Do you agree with that analysis?
No, that's nonsense. And none of these people have read The Institutes of the Christian Religion by Calvin. None of these people have read Martin Luther. Martin Luther is definitely, I mean, Lutheranism is its own thing. I consider Lutheranism to be more, and I'm not putting shade on it. I've got a lot of respect for Lutheranism, but it's not the same thing as Bible Protestantism. I look at Luther as more in the tradition of Meister Eckhart and the kind of German mystics than I do a than I do in the tradition of Bible Protestantism. Like, people say that that's like a lazy thing that a lot of people have glommed onto. It's kind of like a half understood. Part of it's that people like E. Michael Jones, and I got a lot of respect for Jones, and he's a great guy, and he's doing God's work. But like a lot of pious Catholics, he's got a prejudice against people like me. Not in personal terms, but he's got a prejudice against our faith and our denominational heritage. So, like, people read that and they develop this kind of half digested, like, bigoted idea, like, oh, that's them Protestants. They're like Jews and they're doing all this stuff to us. It's fucking stupid. And you know, it's like, if I go, like, I'm a Bible Protestant, that means that the Bible is literally the Word of God, and the Bible is from where we, you know, derive how we kind of know the mind of God. Like, what in the Bible says it's okay to be woke? You know, like, how does that work? You know, it's like if I walk into some like Methodist congregation and there's some like lady pastor there saying that, like, you know, it's, you know, that like men should, quote, marry men. It's like, what's more likely, that, you know, this lady is like some creepy freak who, you know, is kind of doing the same, is engaged in the same kind of endeavor as, you know, the Chinese communist functionary who's, you know, passing off Mao as Jesus? Is it more likely she's doing that? Or is it more likely that, you know, actually Protestantism is about, you know, turning people gay under, you know, because we're secretly Jewish, and, you know, even though, like, you don't see that, it's just like what we do behind closed doors. Or, like, also this idea that, quote unquote, you know, capitalism is a Calvinist contrivance, and that capitalism ruins everything. Like, that's actually a commie take. And this idea, you know, the relationship of Calvinism, you know, the idea is that you know, like work and productive work, uh you know, being what you know, what those who are, you know, enjoy the grace and favor of God are inclined towards. That's not some like oppressor idea. That's not like Jewish. What's Jewish is usury. And there's few things. There's few things more literally antichrist than usury. And what people are talking about when they invoke the boogeyman of quote capitalism is they're talking about usury. To your point about the language being important and people not being lazy with it, that's actually another perfect example. Like I'm constantly coming down not just on people who we talk in conversational terms, but academics like Mearsheimer who damn well know better. I'm constantly telling people to stop using the term quote democracy because after 1989 is literally a meaningless term. It's a floating signifier that officialdom uses to mean literally good guyism.
Well, right, and that's one of my favorite Paul Gottfried insights. Is his book on fascism, which he essentially has an essay where he says, "Look, if you substitute the word fascism for very bad and democracy for very good, it really means the same thing."
No, exactly. It's double plus goodism. Okay, so similarly, capitalism. If you go around saying capitalism when you really mean usury, you're not only is that kind of obnoxious because frankly that's what half-educated Marxists used to do in 35 years ago, but it's also there's not if you actually read scripture and if you actually understand the Christian faith and if you actually understand Calvinism, there's not something bad about money. There's not something dirty about wanting to profit from your labor. Was the reason why usury is a gross affront to God is because usury doesn't have anything to do with labor. It doesn't have to do with reaping the fruits of labor. It has nothing to do with profit, which can then be utilized for the common good, or for the benefit of the laborer. Like what usury is, it's quite literally trying to extrapolate profit from something sterile, which is money. Essentially, conning people to multiply money is has nothing to do with work, has nothing to do with with justice in social terms. It has nothing to do with it has nothing to do with actual prosperity and providing sustenance to the congregation. So this idea that that there's something quote unquote Jewish, or there's something like dirty or like unchristian about an emphasis on work ethic and success. I mean that's a loser mentality among other things. And like I said, like none of these freaking people who go around claiming that like my heritage is Jewish or woke, like none of them can explain why. And it's like, for better or worse, man, like I went to 8 years of Sunday school and all you do in Calvinist Sunday school is read the Bible. Like, I guarantee you that I know more about I know more about scripture than some dude who like converted to Catholicism last year and decided that I'm Jewish and I'm woke because like I read the Bible instead of,
right. Yeah. It's dumb. It's low IQ. It's interesting that you bring up kind of the connection
it's the same
classically.
Yeah. I made the point of people too, like making that point. The same thing is, it's like saying that is like saying like, and then I've also had people say like, well, Calvinism is bullshit because it means anybody can say the Bible means anything. I'm like, no, man, it doesn't. Okay, like the Bible actually does mean something. The fact that some crazy Jewish guy or some crazy Marxist can claim like, oh, gay marriage is fine, according to the Gospels. That's like saying that like, oh, actually, you have a right to abortion according to the Fourth Amendment. It's not really about search and seizure and privacy that accrues within the body of the person and their effects. It actually has to do with a woman's penumbric right to privacy, which leads to abortions. Like the fact that people are capable of saying things like that have no in rationalizing them under the auspices of constitutional legitimacy or scriptural authority, like doesn't somehow mean like intrinsic to the U.S. Constitution is a right to abortion. So like we need the Pope to interpret this for us. That doesn't happen. Like that's ridiculous. Like, I'm not saying most Catholics think that way because they don't. But yeah, the kind of basic bitches who go around claiming that Calvinists are woke, like that's literally like the kind of shit that they're proceeding on.
Well, it's a really basic intellectual mistake that you see everywhere, which is someone turned a good thing into a bad thing. Therefore, the original thing is bad. It's stupid, right? Like you can see almost anything that has been corrupted, and just by nature of being corrupted, or a corrupted version existing rather, does not mean that the original thing was not good to begin with. It's stupid.
Well, it's also, if you want to deep dive into, I'm a right Hegelian, frankly, so I don't approach things in these terms, but if you want to deep dive into what the kind of orientation of these Enlightenment progressive types, whether you're talking about Bentham, whether you're talking about Thomas Jefferson, who frankly was a Jacobin, so it's crazy to me all these white nationalists think they love Thomas Jefferson. Okay, but it's if you want to know what these guys were up, well, like a lot of these Freemason types, if you want to know like what they were up on, I mean, I'm saying like them in addition to the people I just mentioned, they had really weird like Rosicrucians. They were big into that kind of stuff. They like Newton in like something Michael Jones deep dives into. There's like this really, really weird like Newton was like he was fixated on like rebutting a bunch of Platonic and also Aristotelian concepts. That's not just some kind of like weird like Straussian conceit about like exegesis from Newton or something like that. Like he really was in dialogue with both the the Roman Church scholastics, as well as as Plato and Aristotle, and trying to kind of like rebut, like the foundations of the Western canon that had preceded the scientific revolution, which he considered himself to be astride. They said these guys were not relying; they weren't like reading scripture and trying to tease out these kinds of destructive, like radical premises, correctly or not, from the letter of the Bible. Like that was not what their orientation was. I mean, like I said, I think that kind of stuff's overstated anyway. There's epochal forces that gave rise to these disruptions of a political and sociological nature, and the non-Jewish partisans of these ideas and values and kind of revolutionary sentiments, they were basically animated by historical perspectives that tended to profit them and their class. And some of them were just taken in by hubris, weren't particularly committed to anything, and they kind of wanted to insinuate themselves as a new priestly caste, and they found common cause, frankly, more often than not with Jews, because Jews were on the odds with the ancient regime anyway. That's a better way to understand it. But even if your orientation is, you want to look at kind of what the source materials were, or what kind of the guiding philosophies were of these people. Like I said, you're not talking about Bible Protestantism. You're not talking about the King James Bible. That's not what they were relying upon. It's frankly it's really weird stuff. Like even the whole concept. I mean, speaking again of language, the whole concept of the quote Enlightenment is strange. Like look at how that's characterized. Like that, like the Middle Age. I don't like the linear. I don't like the linear paradigm of history. Ancient, medieval, modern. But calling the medieval period the quote Dark Ages, and then suddenly but then abruptly like the light of reason was cast upon the world, and there's this handful of godlike men, words bearers. Like that's bizarre, and that's ridiculous. I mean, that's not like that's not how history develops. That's not how ideas develop.
Well, right, and it's interesting because there are certain ideas that I feel like people reiterate without realizing what they're affirming. And that idea of the Enlightenment is kind of you're kind of reifying your enemy's premise in a way, right? But if you look at the Middle Ages, right, like obviously, like especially post the collapse of the Roman Empire, there was to a certain extent a civilizational collapse, right? That happened. I'm not going to deny that. But the idea that the next 1,000 years were just horrible, grinding misery for everyone is absurd. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, I'd prefer to live in my comfortable air-conditioned apartment than, a mud shack in the middle of Saxony. But that said, like, we are living in a dramatic deviation from the historical norm. And realistically, for the most of the people living through the Middle Ages, their standard of life was essentially the same. In many cases, better, because I mean, if you're a barbarian chieftain, or living under a barbarian chieftain in the woods of Upper Germany, well, all of a sudden you have a baron, and not all of a sudden, but, I'm being flippant, right? But once you have a baron, your level of civilizational and organizational structure goes up dramatically.
Well, look at it like this too. Look at it like what's called the quote, Dark Ages. To your point, that literally spans 1,000 years. Okay, like think about 1,000 years prior to this moment right now. Like 1,008. What the fuck does like 100? Does like 1100 AD have in common with 2022? That is totally insane to consider this part of a common epoch. It's like you tell me that 700 AD and 1300 AD, like where there's all these common features. It was part of the same kind of like political or historical or sociological epoch. Like that's ridiculous. Like I realized that there was the scientific revolution was a real thing. That's not some Enlightenment myth. And I realized that there's a punctuated equilibrium to technological innovation. Okay, and Schumpeter made that point again and again. And you've got to understand that if you want to understand his entire paradigm of business cycles, among other things. But so I realized that things, living man's condition, his relationship to his environment, like leapfrogged in ways that were not well precedented in the last 200 years. Yeah, 200 to 300 years. Okay, but at the same time, it's still absurd to claim that, an 800-year, an arbitrarily kind of corralled, like 800-year period of time just represented, some kind of like to your point, some kind of endless phase of grinding misery, and it's like I don't. Plus, I've asked people before, like what incredible thing, like if you live in if you live in Terre Haute, Indiana, and you're like some just kind of run of the mill like lower middle class guy who like works at a Target or a Walmart. He goes home and plays video games and stuff, and like eats bad food. Like what awesome things is he up on that? Yeah, like a peasant in 1400 AD, like Romania, like wasn't up on. Like I don't get it. It's like, yeah, okay. I mean, it's good you won't die of smallpox anymore, I guess, but you may very well like OD on fentanyl. I'm not making light of that, but
right. But you
may develop diabetes and have a shitty, like kind of last phase of your life. But like other than some of these kinds of diseases owing to poor sanitation, at the macro level, like what awesome stuff is like Walmart man like doing that like peasant man like wasn't doing. I honestly don't. I'm not just being flippant or making a polemical point. Like I honestly don't get it.
Well, and this goes back to your point about kind of the natural slave caste. Because a good friend of mine, my mentor, he goes by George Bagby in these circles. He's a really interesting guy. Part of the reason I'm here intellectually at all. But he ended up getting doxxed and fired for being connected to Abbeville and a few other institutions on our side of things.
Oh, that's terrible.
And so my friends and I all kind of banded together. We're going to help this guy out, and we helped him move down to the middle of nowhere, Louisiana. And when you go through the middle of nowhere, Louisiana, this is not where he lives, but it's a town within a 50-mile radius, so I'm not doxing him. But there's this place called Donaldville, Louisiana, and all of the houses that are old enough to have survived Katrina essentially have been there for 150 years, right? That's how Louisiana works. If it's sturdy enough to last one hurricane, it can generally make most of them.
Yeah.
But you look at the descendants of sharecroppers, right, who were essentially freed slaves.
Yeah.
And they're living in worse conditions to the ones they would have been living, as essentially chattel, right?
Oh, yeah.
It's the same house. It hasn't been repaired. It's horribly maintained. If it has power, it's only barely and off and on.
Yeah.
And you're like, well, look, like my point is not, therefore I would volunteer to be first one in line to slap my hands in irons, right? But you do look at it and you're like, well, maybe the idea that what people really need is this kind of like nebulous power to self-define, you know, that, oh, we're better now because we can choose our own, you know, path through life. Like, to me, that seems to be very manifestly a lie, you know. And
Well, it's particularly insidious, and I made this point before, and this is kind of in my face every day because I like where I live and the demographics and some of the things that are afoot here. I'm not making a judgment about what I'm not sitting here. I'm going to qualify what I'm about to say, but I'm not saying that like the black race is some victim cast or anything like that. But you know, the regime has no credibility to claim to invoke these myths because it proceeded after the civil rights revolution failed, or after you know turning ethnically breaking up white ethnically cleansing white parish communities, you know, by using blacks as their proxy warriors. After blacks no longer useful, the regime locked them all in prison. I mean, so it's like I'm not saying there's some conspiracy against blacks, but it's like you can't claim that like blacks are better off in prison than as slaves. You know, like it's not. So I mean, it's like it's even more punctuate. Yeah, your point is absolutely correct too. Like a lot of people in modernity, their lives are not any better and arguably are worse than that of, you know, agrarian slaves. But like the regime literally took these people who were the descendants of those slaves, you know, locked them in prison, like literally, and then says like, yeah, slavery was the greatest human evil ever to occur, and now these people are free. Like that's literally at odds with reality. You know, like it'd be one thing if the relationship of blacks to the regime was not pathologically dysfunctional, or if you know, blacks were basically out of sight and kind of like living like reservation Indians, and you know, however like dysfunctional that may be, but you know, but the fact of the matter is, it's like literally what I said. And I don't want to get into some like big discussion like what the causes of that are. And again, I'm not saying there's always some like conspiracy or quote racism, which is a meaningless term anyway. But you can't look at a population that you've locked in prison and claim that they are now better off because, you know, their status as slaves has been abolished by constitutional amendment. And plus, it's focusing on slavery as a gross moral evil that's totally arbitrary. The base of civilization 500 years in the future declaring that, you know, 20th century France was the most evil country ever because they had abortion on demand. Like abortion on demand is terrible, but that's an arbitrary like singular thing to focus on. It's like why is slavery the worst thing ever? Yeah, like why? You know, I'm gonna explain.
It's a relative human constant, and look, like you and I have a pretty deep understanding of human depravity, right? Just because people do it doesn't mean it's okay.
Yeah,
but it is an odd variable to choose to maximize the point of your society. And the thing I always think about, right, is like, look, I'm not a medievalist, but if you look at the amount of protections the medieval peasant had, you know, it's kind of absurd, right? The amount of mandatory feast days, the amount of time essentially off they had, you know? And you look at that, and not only the fact that like, well, you don't have to worry about a job. You know, no lord is going to kick you off your land. You know, and that doesn't mean that your life is perfect by any means, right? Like it was a harsh existence, but this idea that, you know, that this is the exact perfect way to run a society is just absurd, you know?
No, it's crazy, and it's also it's anti-human. Like I made the point of people. I mean, just one of the interesting things about the COVID nonsense. There's a lot of interesting things about it, including that it was, you know, this. I mean, it was a case of like totally bizarre mass hysteria over, you know. I mean, and it was a splendid example of the regime, you know, owing to its you know it's been owing to its obsolescence. That's, you know, since 1980, since, you know, November 9th, 1989. You know, it's constantly trying to confabulate some raison d'etre for it to continue to exist. But aside from all of that, I was fascinated that like the kind of the normies, it took that from to realize that it doesn't make any sense for them to like send their kid to public school. It's like, so you're gonna force your kid to go to a building for 8 hours where these weird, you know, like mediocre kind of troubled people who you find, you know, working as public school teachers, like have like force them to do math problems over and over. Why? Like, what would that accomplish? Like, even even if I accept the premise that, like, children need some sort of training to do things, which I don't think makes a lot of sense either, frankly, like, just in general terms. But it's like, what's accomplished by the idea that this is like something that, like, that's naturally, like, beneficial to children, to force them to sit in a room for 8 hours, or in a series of rooms, like, doing busy work over and over. Like, what could that possibly accomplish?
Well, right. And like, you could at least see the argument if, well, we had flying cars and, we were one step away from interstellar travel, right? Like, if we lived in
Yeah.
the Jetsons world, it's like, okay, well, it's weird, but at least it's working. But I
Yeah.
think that you have to be a truly singularly delusional person to look at American public education and say, that seems to be working perfectly, right?
No, exactly, and it's like, it's just really strange. It's just strange how people can't put these things together and realize that, not only were a lot of these things pointless from inception, but it's also America really is. There's these obsolete. You're surrounded by obsolescent structures. Like, the entire regime itself is obsolescent. Like, that's what's interesting. Like, if you look at a regime like Russia or like China or like Turkey, like, those regimes are all screwed up, and those aren't particularly nice places to live, and there's like all kinds of corruption to those systems. But they're actually, like, more kind of, they more reflect the 21st century in a lot of ways than America does. Like, in terms of, I'm not talking like culturally or something, or in terms of technological development, although America's very much slipping in that regard too. But, like, what I mean is that, like, America's just forever pretending it's the 20th century, and these institutions that are tailored to fight the Cold War just must exist in perpetuity. Like, do you realize that, like, America's largest, quote, NATO ally is Turkey, and America's fighting a proxy shooting war against Turkey right now, while at the same time claiming NATO exists.
Right. It's vestigial is too kind a word, right?
I mean, should America attack itself because Turkey's at war with America and it's obligated by the NATO Charter to, like, attack people who attack Turkey? I mean, I don't, it's like and people think the kind of pitfall of this historian is that he can develop tunnel vision about the institutions as well as the epoch that is kind of the subject of his focus. People periodically accuse me of having Cold War on the brain. I don't think I do, but even if I did, the point is, it's, national governments aren't, modern state governments. I'm talking post-Westphalian state governments. They're not capable of doing much, and they're not tailored to do much. Like, what they're there to do is basically to wage war against other regimes that are structured like they are. It's not this thing that, is tailored to, colonize space and, make children smarter, and, to help men and women get along better, and, like solve people's medical problems. And, like, the fact that people would think it is really, really strange. And as structured, the U.S. regime, which is basically, the New Deal regime, because that's when this whole restructuring was implemented. Okay, it's everything about it is tailored to wage a major war, and that's it. And after the early 50s, it became structured very much to wage a general nuclear war. And what we're doing right now is, talking on the internet, we're talking over what was developed as a secondary command and control mechanism that can survive after a first strike. That's why it exists. Okay. And that can't be denied. Okay. Like, it's not me just, kind of, because I'm getting old and cantankerous and inflexible in my thought or something, just, kind of trying to pigeonhole all phenomenon that is under discussion into this kind of paradigm that I'm fixated on. But
No, that's insightful, man. And again, I don't want to keep you too long. You've already talked
yeah,
to me
well,
longer
we'll,
than you
we'll
were
raise up in
planning
a minute,
to.
because frankly, like, I don't mean to sound like an old woman, but I'm in a little bit of pain. I kind of got to let myself get out of the seated position. But yeah,
Well, sure thing, man. So if you could just get your plugs out of the way, and then I'll let you go.
Oh yeah, no, this was great, and we can do this again next week or the week after, if you want to. Like, don't hesitate to reach out. And you should join me and Ace when we go live sometime too. I mean, just don't be shy about insinuating yourself into such things. It wouldn't be obtuse for you to do so. But yeah, you can find. I've got a science fiction brand called Steel Storm. I published through Imperium Press, which are great guys, and they're a great brand. You should check out their entire catalog. But the sequel to my first book, Steel Storm, is dropping imminently. I behoove you to buy it through Imperium Press because they're dear friends of mine and friends of ours, and they're very much aligned with our cause. You can find me on Telegram. Telegram has been blowing up. We've got a really great community there, and it's a great place to get real news and real kind of takes, not just on what's underway in our circles, but just generally. You can find me there at the t.me/the HOMAS 777. You can find me on Gab. I got nothing against Gab, but I'm not super up on like that, social media and short form blogging. But Gab is basically a mirror of what I post on my Substack and on Telegram. You can find me there at Real Thomas777. You can find me on Substack, which is where my podcast is, where my long form is. It's only $5 a month to join. You can afford that unless you're a hobo. I behoove, but about half the content there is totally free. It's realthomas777.substack.com. And that is how you can find me. And don't hesitate to reach out on any of these platforms if you want to talk to me direct. I'm very, very accessible.
All right. Well, thanks, Thomas. As you guys know, all my links are down in the description. At the urging of Aura's posts, I've added a link where you can buy me a coffee. If you think this episode was worth anything, I'd really appreciate $1 or $2. But if not, I don't mind, guys. And remember, keep your head up. The lie can't last forever. Goodbye.